Hello and welcome to the Gritty Films Nitty Griddy review of the 2017 movie The Disaster Artist. This is a biopic directed by James Franco and written by Scott Neustadter and Michael H. Weber, and starring James Franco and Dave Franco as Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero, respectively. The Disaster Artist is rated R for some language throughout and some sexuality and nudity. If you haven't seen The Disaster Artist, it's kind of like if the movies Ed Wood and The Room had a baby, and that baby movie grew up to be directed by James Franco. It's not my best, but I think it works. If you haven't seen The Room, I highly recommend you do so before seeing The Disaster Artist. It's not required by any means. The Disaster Artist holds up on its own as a solid movie. That said, I do think at least some familiarity with The Room will enhance your experience of watching The Disaster Artist, and I do have a nitty-gritty review of The Room posted as well if you'd like to check that out. So the first category of my grid is going to be genre. Now, I talked a lot in my review of The Room about how it was really hard to place within a genre, just because it was so loosely defined. The Disaster Artist is equally difficult to place into a genre, but for kind of the opposite reason. It has a lot of really well-defined elements of a few different genres, primarily the biopic and the buddy film. And what I find interesting is that in The Disaster Artist, a lot of the sillier buddy movie scenes are actually in there to kind of tone down the craziness that is Tommy Wiseau. Normally in a biopic, particularly one that's trying to be more of a comedy, you get these silly scenes to kind of liven up the more boring aspects of, based on a true story. The buddy film tropes in The Disaster Artist were a little bit thick at times, particularly not within the more comedic scenes, but within the kind of more heartwarming, scenes about their friendship. It verged a little bit on the cheesy at times. To show a genuine friendship between them, I think they had to get a little bit cheesy just to kind of tone down the craziness and make it a little bit more relatable. So even though I did find it bordering on cheesy at times, I think it actually worked fairly well. So for the genre category overall, I gave it an 8.67 out of 10, which I considered to be an A-. This is actually going to be one of the weaker categories in the film, which says a lot. I mean, an A- that's a strong score, and really the only weakness within the genre was just that they got a little bit, like I said, bordering on cheesy with some of the a little bit more tropey buddy comedy relationship scenes. But it wasn't bad by any means, and I think they did a good job of balancing the buddy comedy and the biopic aspects in interesting ways. The next category in the grid is going to be writing, and I thought writing was one of the strongest points in The Disaster Artist. What I really like about this script is that they were able to take this larger-than-life, way out there character of Tommy Wiseau and the not super interesting character of Greg Sestero, and they were able to bounce them off of each other. Tommy Wiseau inherently made Greg Sestero more interesting, and Greg Sestero inherently made Tommy Wiseau more relatable. I also like that the script didn't try too hard to explain anything about Tommy Wiseau. I mean, he truly is an enigma. I mean, they did a good job of bringing a humanity and a relatability to the character while also keeping that enigma very much at the center. I also like that the filmmakers didn't shy away from showing kind of the more negative sides of Tommy Wiseau. He definitely has these childish, immature, and sometimes outright mean moments, but then he also has sides of his personality that are really admirable. The way he can take negative situations and embrace them and turn them into something positive. I mean, he takes what life hands him and turns it into something else. And it just goes way beyond even just, turning lemons into lemonade. I mean, he's taking lemons and turning it into 24 lemon meringue pies. It's pretty incredible. So even though you do definitely see sides of him that make him more human and make him unlikable even, you do see these other sides that are admirable. Another aspect of The Disaster Artist that I really liked was we see people laughing at Tommy. We see people telling him he'll never make it. There's one scene where he's told, you need to be villains, and he insists he's a hero, and then everybody laughs at him, and his response is like, I'm not the villain, you're the villain. That's an ugly thing to do, to laugh at somebody. And I think that's interesting to have that conversation in this movie, because obviously the movie that he's going to make is going to be famous because people laugh at it. So to see him kind of go from a transition of projecting villainy onto people who laugh at him to then by the end accepting it and embracing it because they like his work. They're misinterpreting it from his point of view, but it makes them happy, and he wants to be a part of that. So I just thought that whole character arc was weirdly, or maybe not weirdly, I don't know, but it was inspiring. So I just think it was a really well-crafted script that focused on characters and kind of just got people thinking in different ways about this movie that's been a cult classic for almost 15 years now. So I gave the writing a total score of 9.2 out of 10, which is going to be a solid A. So the next category is going to be the editing and the special effects. And within this category, it was definitely very well edited, but there wasn't really anything that stood out as perfect and nothing that I can really point to as a flaw. The pacing was a little bit slow at times, particularly between the time when Tommy and Greg arrive in LA until they decide to make the room. There were definitely some really good scenes in there and nothing that I would consider, removing altogether, but I feel like some of those scenes could have been cut down a little bit. Even the scene with Greg's mom, I felt could have been a little bit shorter. I'm glad they got as much Megan Mullally time in there as they could. I understand why they wouldn't want to cut any of that. But as far as storytelling goes, I think that scene probably could have been at least a minute shorter and we wouldn't have missed anything. So things like that where I definitely like the scenes and I think they played out just fine the way they were. But as far as moving the story along, I felt they could have been cut down a little bit. And I know that the friendship between Wiseau and Sestero is the main focus as opposed to the making of the room. So I understand why those scenes were there and why they were the length they were. Again, as far as storytelling goes, it didn't do a ton for me. So that was one of the bigger flaws that I noticed within the editing. So for the editing and special effects overall, I gave it a 7.6 out of 10, which is going to be a B+. Not quite pushed into that A range, but still very strong, above average. B+ is a good grade. The next category is going to be the sound design, and this is another category where it was definitely very well done, but there's nothing really that stood out as perfect and nothing that stood out as an obvious flaw. The songs throughout, I think, give it a liveliness that matches Wiseau's personality really well as the time period really well, because I think it's important to remember that this is also a period piece, technically. I mean, it takes place in roughly the same time period as Lady Bird, which is another movie that's getting a lot of buzz. So with that in mind, I thought the soundtrack did a really good job of reminding us of the time as well as matching Wiseau's personality and just the energy of the movie. I also liked that we got to hear some of the actual music from The Room playing during the screening at the end of the movie. For fans of The Room who, you hear it, you know what's going on. It's just a fun touch that didn't have to be there, but it added something extra. So for the sound category, which is going to include the score and soundtrack, as well as the sound effects and the overall sound mix, I gave an 8 out of 10, which is an A-. The next category is going to be the acting and the casting. I think it goes without saying that both the acting and the casting for the main two characters is flawless. James Franco as Tommy Wiseau is just incredible. I mean, he managed to look pretty much just like him. He got the accent just right, which is particularly impressive because nobody knows what that accent is. And even his facial expressions throughout the movie look just like Wiseau. I mean, obviously he has prosthetics to make him look like Wiseau, but just the facial expressions, which would be particularly hindered because of the prosthetics. I have no doubt that he's going to get nominated for a Best Actor. If he wins, my dream is that he'll bring Wiseau on stage with him. My life dream as of 30 seconds ago is to hear Tommy Wiseau give some sort of speech at the Academy Awards. Yeah, but Dave Franco as Greg Sestero was also incredibly well cast, and it wrinkles my brain. Dave Franco and James Franco look extremely similar, obviously being brothers, but then they also somehow manage, James Franco looks just like Tommy Wiseau, Dave Franco looks just like Greg Sestero. You don't even really see a resemblance between them, and for the most part, you forget they're even brothers. It's incredible, the acting and the casting there. Just amazing. The secondary characters were also extremely well cast. I'll admit I was a little bit hesitant when I initially saw them, particularly Ari Grainer, who plays Juliet/Lisa. I just didn't quite see the resemblance. But then at the end of the movie, when you see the side-by-side scenes, it's spot on. I mean, just the attention to detail throughout the movie is incredible. And then also within the secondary characters, we get all three of the hosts of How Did This Get Made, which was awesome. I knew going into it because of the trailers that Paul Scheer was in it, which was pretty exciting to begin with, but I didn't know that Jason Mantzoukas and June Diane Raphael were also in it. Any doubts that I had about the casting, the score was boosted by just having those three in there. That was great. And if you haven't listened to that podcast, I highly recommend it. And a good starting point would be that episode on The Room. So yeah, it was great to see all three of them in there. Wish June Diane Raphael had been in it a little bit more. You can never have too much June. So for the acting and the casting category, I gave The Disaster Artist a 9.43 out of 10, which is going to be an A+. So the next category is going to be directing and cinematography. Disaster Artist is just a really well-crafted movie in every area. The directing and the cinematography is no exception. Particularly, there's the scene where we first meet Tommy. The lighting's really dramatic and the camera's, moving around him. And it just feels very mysterious and grandiose. Like, I feel like you know who Tommy is by the end of that scene. And he's just this combination of an enigma and, mystery and grandioseness, combined with his insane self-confidence and just putting himself out there. That scene just works so perfectly to introduce us to this character. Like I said, by the end of that scene, you pretty much know exactly who Tommy is. And it's really a mark of a solid director with Franco and a solid script, solid cinematographer. A lot of talent working together within that scene. Then there are other scenes in the movie, like the Tommy Wiseau audition scene, that are shot in a much more traditional, realistic lighting, reverse shot, framing. Those more traditionally shot scenes did a really good job of balancing out the character of Wiseau with the kind of stark reality that is LA. So for the directing and cinematography category, I gave The Disaster Artist a 9.33 out of 10, which is a solid A. So I'm going to talk about the next two categories together because they're very closely related with this movie. And it's going to be the character aesthetics and the environmental aesthetics. So for character aesthetics, we have hair, makeup, and costumes. And for environmental aesthetics, we have sets, props, and locations. And in both of these categories, in The Disaster Artist, they just paid such close attention to detail when recreating the scenes of The Room. The sets look identical, the props, the hair, the makeup, the costumes, every single detail you can think of. They show it off at the end of the movie when you see these scenes side by side. It's incredible. And then, like I mentioned before, this movie is also a period piece, technically taking place between 1998 and 2003, I believe. And I thought The Disaster Artist did a really good job of keeping us within that time frame without it feeling like it was, trying to be a period piece. It still felt modern and current, and yet it was obviously took place in that time. Tommy Wiseau, in and of himself, is unique and requires a certain wardrobe and hairstyle. Plus the prosthetics on his face, not to mention that, which, he just looks so much like Tommy Wiseau. It's insane. Just the attention to detail is, it's impressive. It's the craftsmanship is there throughout. I just really couldn't find a single flaw within either the character aesthetics or the environmental aesthetics. So both of those categories I gave perfect 10s to. So the next category is going to be impact on film. Now, as always, this is pretty difficult to judge for such a new film, but I'm going to do my best to kind of give a prediction of where I think this movie is going to fall over time. So the first subcategory with an impact on film is going to be critical impact, and so far the critics definitely seem to like it. It has a very high score on Rotten Tomatoes. It's getting a ton of Oscar buzz. So I gave it 4 out of 5 for the critical impact. So the next subcategory is going to be cult impact, which I also gave a 4 out of 5. I think because it's about a film that has such a cult impact, all the fans of that movie are going to want to go see this movie. I think the fans of The Room are going to appreciate The Disaster Artist. I think think it's a solid movie, and I think it does a good job of honoring The Room and honoring the fans of The Room while also being its own movie and telling a much different story than The Room. I didn't give it a 5 out of 5 because I think some fans of The Room either won't be interested in the movie or won't like the movie for one reason or another. So I don't think it's gonna, bring with it the full cult impacts of The Room. But I think 4 out of 5 is fair for, something that's gonna have very much the same audience as such a cult classic. So the last subcategory is going to be inspirational impacts, and this one, at least for me, is the hardest to predict for such a new movie. But I do think The Disaster Artist, if nothing else, the plot alone, I think is enough to kind of inspire future filmmakers to go out there and try harder and don't rely on luck. Be your best. Go out there and get it done. Inherently, it will speak to future filmmakers and inspire people to get out there. And I also think it is very well made, and it just the craftsmanship in and of itself, I do think that will also inspire people. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 in the subcategory as well. So the impact on film category is going to average out to an 8 out of 10, which is an A-. The last category in my grid is going to be overall enjoyment. And The Disaster Artist easily gets a 10 out of 10. Perfect. If you've seen The Room, it definitely enhances the experience. Like especially seeing at the end, the side-by-side recreations was phenomenal. But then just the humor of the movie. I said in my review of The Room that I hadn't laughed that hard in a long time. But then there were definitely scenes in The Disaster Artist where I was laughing just as hard. It's hilarious. It's heartwarming. It's a tribute to The Room, which is fun. Like, it's just, it has a lot going for it. And it's very enjoyable. I highly recommend it. I also gave The Disaster Artist 1 point of extra credit, and that point is for Tommy Wiseau. I mean, he's a weird dude, but he's weirdly inspiring. I mean, he just doesn't really care what people think, and he embraces people's perceptions of himself and his work, even if he disagrees with it. I just find myself fascinated by him. He's just a unique guy. So, and then the post-credit scene was just, that was amazing. That was the perfect way to cap off the movie. If you haven't seen The Disaster Artist yet, yes, there is a post-credit scene. Man, was that a great surprise. Especially because I had heard that Tommy Wiseau was in a scene, so I was waiting for it the whole movie. And then you see, like, the stock footage of him at the end, and I'm like, surely that can't be it. Like, I don't think I could have missed Tommy Wiseau. But then there it was at the end. So definitely stay to the end, see the post-credit scene. If you already saw The Disaster Artist and you didn't stay for the credits, go see it again and stay till the end. Why not, right? But yeah, so 1 point of extra credit for Tommy Wiseau. So the total score for The Disaster Artist is going to be a 91.23, which is a solid A. So it's not quite pushed into that perfect range, but it's a very solid movie, extremely enjoyable. The craftsmanship and just the filmmaking overall is extremely well done. It's visually appealing, it has humor, it has heart. I really can't recommend this movie enough. It's a really phenomenal movie. So yeah, what are you waiting for? If you haven't seen it, go out and see it. Hey, thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and if you like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube and like and share this video. You can also follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you'd like to learn more about the Griddy Films grid rating system, you can check out the Griddy Films website, and if you'd like to learn how you can support Griddy Films, you can check out the Griddy Films Patreon page. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.